Okay, we're at the ground zero of what happened here, Ford's Theater, right behind me. We're here on 10th Street, and this was kind of a central part of the area. John Wilkes Booth has already left National Theater in the morning. He gets over here more about 11 a.m. and he comes to get his mail, of all things, from Ford's Theater. That's because John Wilkes Booth was such a renowned actor, and he had no central address because he was always going from one place to the next, that he just got his mail sent to different theaters. And he knew the Ford family very well. The Fords opened this theater in 1863, and one of its very first plays featured John Wilkes Booth, and called The Marble Sculptor. And in that, Booth would be an angry sculptor trying to make his statues come to life. Ironically, Abraham Lincoln saw Booth in that play, and Booth saw him too. And he looks up at Lincoln at one part of the play and starts wagging his finger at him and yelling these venomous lines. Now, it's all part of the play, but Lincoln says to his companion at the time, "That guy sure doesn't look like he likes me very much." He thought, boy, that looks awfully personal. Who knew that a year and a half later that it would be personal very much? Now, Booth, let's talk about him as an actor for a moment. John Wilkes Booth was only 26 years old when he kills Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he is very famous at the time. Matter of fact, some people say that he was the Brad Pitt of his time. That's what made this so shocking. There have been 4 presidential assassinations in our country. John F. Kennedy, of course, William Harrison, James Garfield, my 6th cousin, somehow is involved, and Abraham Lincoln. But the only assassin that you largely remember those for was John Wilkes Booth. And the reason for that was because he was very famous. John Wilkes Booth was making more than $500,000 a year in today's money. Back then, about 20 grand a year. And that really made him popular. He would do sometimes 85, 90 plays a year. Not one play 85 times, 85 different plays. Amazing. People really thought Booth was perhaps the greatest actor of the American stage. And ironically, he comes from great stock. His father was considered the first great Shakespearean actor in America. His brother Edwin was also considered a great actor, although after Booth died, John Wilkes, Edwin became more famous. But Booth had only been going on for 7 years, but this was his life. He liked to be around on the stage. He loved the theater life. It made him good money. And so that's why he would come to places like this. This was home. And he knew the Fords, and he's talking to them that morning, and this is when it all comes together. He's talking to Harry Ford, and Harry says, you know, it's Good Friday. I don't know if we're going to have a great crowd here. The theater seats 1,700. You got to remember, this is back before movies came around. And he said, yeah, I don't think we're going to have a good night. But you know what? We got lucky because President Lincoln is coming tonight. So is General Grant. They're bringing their wives. And I'm handing out these poster bills to get the crowd up because, hey, who doesn't want to see President Lincoln? The war's over. He's famous. Everyone's happy. It was a big time. At that moment, Booth thinks, hey, here is my chance. Because he's been trying to figure out a way to assassinate President Lincoln ever since a failed kidnapping attempt 2 weeks earlier. He'd been looking for his chance. Finally, he saw this could be it. But Booth, being an actor, plays it very cool. He takes his mail. He actually sits out on the steps right behind me in the theater and reads it, but he's thinking in his mind, okay, it's go time. I can do this tonight. It's ironic that all of this happened just on a casual conversation of what happens. Now, John Wilkes Booth decides, I've got to go get my horse for this. You know, he doesn't have one. He's going to go rent one. We're going to go down to Pumphrey stable next, where he gets that horse and then moves on to other things. But this is where it all started, right here at Ford's Theater, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. The third stop on our tour is James Pumphrey Stable, and it's right by the National Hotel where we just were a minute ago. What happens, John Wilkes Booth, as we talked earlier, knew now what he was going to do. He needed a fast horse that night to get away after killing President Lincoln, and he decided, I'm going to go to Pumphrey Stable, which ironically is across the street from the National Hotel. And today it is the D.C. courthouse where most of the trials. Ironically, Booth was next door. He had a second-story place in the hotel. He could see this property from his hotel. So today it's ironic he would have seen where his prison would have been. Now, here on the sidewalks, I can tell you that Pumphrey said, yeah, I've got a horse for you. It's not the one you want, but I got a better one for you. I got this young mare that she's really fast. A little skittish, but really fast. Black tail, black mane, black legs. It's a real striking thing with a white star on its horse on its head. And so Booth said, okay, I like it. I'll be back later today for that horse. And he did come back later today and get it right here from Pumphrey's stable. Poor Pumphrey, as they arrested everybody after the assassination, he went to jail for a short period of time because they figured out he'd done nothing but rent a horse. But back then, remember, no cars, everybody got around by horse, and this was a very prominent stable for about another 30 years. Decides to go over to the Willard Hotel. It's now about 12 o'clock noon. And the crazy thing was, a couple weeks later, Mrs. Grant that tells a story, that tells us all about it. She says, you know what, I saw that John Wilkes Booth guy there when I was having lunch at the Willard Hotel. And he was staring at me awful hard, and I wondered what that was about. You know what? He was probably scoping me out, trying to get an ID on me because Mrs. Grant was supposed to be in that box that night. But the Grants decided that they were going to New Jersey to see family. Hey, the war was over, Mrs. Grant was tired too. She wanted to go back to New Jersey, see some family. And so they did not end up being in that box that night, but Booth did not know that at the time. And so she thinks later on Booth is just trying to figure out who is she, what is she going to do. So, ironically, Booth goes from there and decides, okay, my next stop is going to be Mary Surratt. I've got to get over there to the Surratt boarding house. We'll see that in a little while. It's also a few blocks from here. And Mary Surratt is what they call the woman who hatched the nest of the conspiracy. Whether she did, big decisions on that. But Mary Surratt has a boarding house just 3 blocks from here. Booth brings a package that's tied up and says, Mary, I need you to give this to John Lloyd back at your boarding house in Clinton, Maryland, because I'm going to be there tonight. Now, many of you have heard about the Surratt house, and that's actually a very different building than the boarding house here in D.C. Mary Surratt owned a place with her husband, John Surratt, who happens to be my third cousin. And at that point, he passes away about 6 months before all of this. And Mary decides to be down in the country. She can't make a living really going at it, because John Surratt was also the postmaster and a bunch of other things. She decides to come in here and open a boarding house, but she still owns the other place. And there's been a lot of talk that there was a lot of conspiracy theories there. People would meet there. Her son John Surratt was known as a Confederate spy. Ironically, was not in town right now. But Booth had met her before, and so he goes there and they talk for about half an hour. And he says, I want you to do these things for me. That's going to prove fatal for Mary Surratt because she's later hanged for her involvement in this. Mary Surratt, the first woman in U.S. history to be hanged. Was she really guilty? I don't know. There's going to be a movie out with Robert Redford directing it pretty soon, and it goes all through it. You can make up your own mind. But Booth stays there for about half an hour, gets his things in order, and then he decides, okay, what's next? I mean, the man never stopped moving the entire day. And he goes over to the National Theater. Wait a minute, National Theater is right by the Willard, about half a mile from here. You're thinking, John, couldn't you have kind of stayed in the same area? But, okay, the man moved around. You know, John Wilkes Booth was only 5'8", very thin guy. I tell you why, I kept walking all over this town. Anyway, he goes back to National Theater, where of course he has friends, and he decides to write a letter to the editor of the National Intelligencer, where he explains why he's going to kill Lincoln, why all of this happens. So he hands that letter to his friend, John Matthews. He says, John, hold on to this letter till Sunday, and if you don't hear from me, I want you to give this letter to the National Intelligencer staff. And it's going to explain everything, what happens. Needless to say, the next morning when John Matthews wakes up and finds out that Booth has killed President Lincoln, he opens that letter to see what in the world is in this and reads the whole thing. Now, I don't blame John Matthews for saying, hey, this is going to get me hanged as part of this conspiracy theory. He rips up the letter, never says a word to anybody for 2 years about what happened. And he was right to do that, because if he had brought that forward, I guarantee you he would have probably been hanged as part of a conspiracy, even though he had nothing to do with it. But that was all part of the legend. We'll never know exactly what Booth wrote in that letter.